Evening, friend, come sit by the fire. There's coffee on the stones if you want it, and the night's not going anywhere. So take your time settling in. Got a story tonight about a man who sat in a little stone jail for 3 long weeks, counting the days on the wall with a piece of soft stone, waiting to learn whether he would live or hang, and about the one man in all the territory who could tell him, a circuit judge 3 weeks overdue on an empty road, and not a word as to why. Now, the reason that judge was late is the whole heart of this story, friend. It's the kind of reason that once the town finally learned it, not a soul could look at the matter the same way again. So, pour yourself something warm. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears, and let me tell you how it was, the way I heard it told, on a soft spring a long time gone. The man in the cell had counted the days on the wall with a bit of soft stone. 3 weeks of them now, a row of little scratched marks climbing toward the corner. Out past the one small window he could see the road, the long empty road that came down out of the hills into the town. And every morning he woke and looked at it, and it was empty. And every night he lay down and it had stayed empty all the day long. They were waiting on the judge, the same as he was. The circuit judge who came once a year to hear the cases and pass the sentences. And right on, the man in the cell was waiting to be told whether he would live or hang. And the only soul in all that wide territory who could tell him was somewhere out on that empty road, 3 weeks overdue, and not a single word as to why. Now, what kept that judge, and what it would come to mean for the man counting days on the wall? That's the story I want to tell you tonight. Welcome to Western Sleep Story, where the Old West carries you to sleep. Every week, I sit by this fire and tell a new tale, slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting. The town this happened in was called Cedar Gap, and it sat at the foot of a long range of blue mountains in a country where the law came calling about as often as the circuit rider's church, which is to say, once a year, if the weather held. There was no judge who lived there. There was no courthouse to speak of, just the back room of the land office with a flag in the corner and a Bible on a shelf. What Cedar Gap had instead was a custom, and the custom was this. Once each spring when the snow let off the high passes and the roads dried enough to travel, a circuit judge came riding down out of the hills. And for 2 or 3 days he sat and heard every case that had piled up over the long year. The disputes and the debts, the drunken disorderlies, and now and again, the hard cases, the ones a man's life hung on. And then he rode on to the next town and the next, and Cedar Gap went back to settling its smaller troubles for itself, and waiting on him to come round again. That spring, there was a hard case waiting, the hardest the town had seen in years. His name was Will Tanner, and he was a young man not much past 24, lean and quiet, with the look of someone who had been on the road a long while and had stopped expecting much from it. He'd drifted into the country looking for work. There was always work in the spring, fences to mend and stock to move, and the new road crews hiring. and he had the misfortune to come down the old mountain road into Cedar Gap on the very worst evening of his life. Because what the men of the town found, when they rode out at dusk after hearing a commotion on the road, was young Will Tanner kneeling in the dirt over the body of a dead man, with the dead man's blood on his hands, and the dead man's leather wallet on the ground beside him. The dead man was a stranger, too, an older fellow, gray and gaunt, maybe 60 years old, fallen by the roadside with his horse standing off a little way cropping grass. To the men who found them, the story told itself in a single glance, the way a story will when you already half know what you expect to see. A young drifter, an old traveler with money in his coat, a lonely stretch of road at dusk. They did not need to be told what had happened. They had decided what had happened before they were off their horses. Will Tanner tried to tell them otherwise. He told them, and he would go on telling them the same way every day for 3 weeks, never changing a word of it, that he had come upon the old man already down, already dying, thrown from his horse it looked like, and bleeding, that he had knelt to help him. You have to understand how it looked to those men, friend, coming down on that scene in the failing light. They had ridden out because a boy minding sheep on the hill had come running into town saying there'd been trouble on the old road, a man down, a stranger over him. They came expecting the worst, and a man who comes expecting the worst has a way of finding it whether it's there or not. By the time their horses pulled up in the dusk, their minds were 3/4 made. They saw a stranger's hands red to the wrist. They saw a dead man and a loose horse and a wallet in the dirt. They did not see, because they were not of a mind to see, a young man's face gone white with shock, nor the careful way he was still half cradling the dead man's head out of the dust even as they bore down on him, which is not the way a robber holds a man he's just killed for his purse. They saw what they had ridden out to see, and once a thing like that has been seen by enough men at once, it hardens into fact faster than river ice in January, and no amount of true words will melt it after. He told them the rest as they tied his hands, told it plain, not pleading, just laying it down like a man setting out the only thing he owns, that the old man had not long left in him, and had known it, and with his last strength had pressed his wallet into Will's hands and begged him to carry it on. To a woman, he said, a woman at the river crossing on the old road, and to tell her he was sorry that he'd come at last, that he'd been coming to find her. And then the old man had died, right there with his hand still gripping Will's sleeve, and Will had been kneeling there not a minute trying to take in what he'd been asked, when the riders came down the road and saw what they saw and took him. It was, the town agreed, a very poor story. There was no woman at any river crossing that anyone knew of. The old road over the mountains, the one Will and the dead man had both come down, had been little used in years, ever since the easier road was cut around the south end of the range. Folks said nobody lived out that way anymore, that the old crossings were washed out and the cabins long empty. A woman at the crossing was a story a guilty man would invent, they said, knowing no one could go and check it before the snow closed the passes again. And there was the wallet besides. To the town's way of thinking, the wallet settled it past all argument. A wallet with the dead man's money still in it, lying right there in the dirt at the young stranger's knee. What was that, they asked one another over their suppers and across their fences, but a robbery caught before the robber could finish it? They did not stop to wonder why a thief would still be kneeling in the open road beside the man he'd robbed, with a purse in plain view and his horse standing ready not 10 feet off, instead of being a mile gone into the hills with it. They did not stop to wonder much of anything. A town that has decided a thing rarely does. The wallet that should have saved Will Tanner. For an honest thief is a thing that does not exist, and a man who keeps the purse in the open is a man who never meant to take it. Became, in the town's certain mind, the very rope that would hang him. So they put Will Tanner in the little stone jail at the end of the street. And because the country was sure of his guilt, and because the law was a year-long way off, the town did a thing that out there was only sensible. They built the gallows so it would be ready, and they settled in to wait for the judge. 3 weeks is a long time, friend, to sit in a stone box and wait to be told whether you'll see another summer. I have known men who came apart under far less. But the strange thing about Will Tanner, the thing the sheriff couldn't make sense of and turned over in his mind many a night, was that the young man did not come apart. He grew quiet, and then quieter, but it was not the quiet of a man breaking. It was something more like the quiet of a man who has told the truth and been disbelieved, and has nothing left to do but wait and see whether the world will sort itself out before it's too late. The sheriff's name was Hatch, and he was not a cruel man, whatever the gallows out his window might have suggested. He was a man caught, the way decent men so often are, between what he'd been raised to do and what his own 2 eyes kept telling him. By every rule he knew, Will Tanner was a killer caught red-handed, and his job was to keep him fed and locked up until the judge came to settle it. But Hatch had locked up a good many men in his years, and he knew the smell of a guilty one, the way they'd bluster and then crack, change their story, plead and bargain and curse. Will Tanner did none of that. He told his tale once, plain, and then he stopped asking to be believed, which Hatch had learned over the years was a thing guilty men almost never did. Guilty men always kept asking. And so the sheriff fed him and locked him up and did his duty and lay awake some nights all the same. There was one thing in particular that gnawed at Hatch late in those nights, and it was a matter of the wallet. He had counted the money in it himself. The evening they brought the young man in, and he had written the sum down careful in his book, and the sum had troubled him ever since, for it was all there, every coin and every folded note, untouched. Now Hatch was no scholar, but he had sense enough to follow a simple road, and the simple road ran thus. A man kills another man for his purse, and then does not take so much as a single coin out of it. It made no sense. He had turned it every way a tired mind can turn a thing, and it had refused stubbornly to add up. He had even said as much, once, to the men who'd made the arrest, and they had looked at him as if he'd gone soft, and said the boy was caught before he could pocket it. And that had been the end of the conversation. But it had not been the end of it for Hatch. The wallet sat in his strong box, and the question sat in his chest, and neither one would leave him be. Will asked for 2 things in those 3 weeks, and only 2. The first was a bit of soft stone to mark the days on the wall, so he wouldn't lose track of how long he'd been waiting. The second was stranger. He asked the sheriff more than once whether anyone had thought to ride out the old road to the river crossing just to look, just to see if there was a woman out there after all. And Hatch had to tell him every time that no one had and no one would, because the spring melt had the rivers up and the old road was no fit place for a horse this time of year, and because, though the sheriff didn't say this part out loud, nobody in town believed for 1 minute there was anyone out there to find. Will would nod at that and look at the floor a while, and then he'd say soft, "She's out there, though." He wasn't lying. A man doesn't lie with his hand going cold on your sleeve. And then he'd go quiet again. Out the small window, the road ran empty. Now, the judge they were all waiting on was a man named Ambrose Sayer, and his reputation had ridden into Cedar Gap long before this particular spring. Judge Sayer had ridden the circuit for 30 years, through that whole web of far towns scattered along the mountains, and in all that time, folks said it with a kind of awe, he had never once been late. Floods, blizzards, lame horses, sickness, whatever the road threw at him, Ambrose Sayer arrived on the day he was due, near to the hour, and held his court. He was known for it the way some men are known for a fast gun or a good singing voice. He was a hard judge by all accounts. Fair, but hard. A man who weighed the law to the grain and handed down what it called for without much soft feeling left over. 30 years of other men's troubles had worn the give out of him, the way 30 years of anything will. But he was honest, and he was prompt, and a country with little law to spare set great store by both. So you can imagine, friend, the unease that crept over Cedar Gap as the days went by and the road stayed empty. Judge Sayer was due the first week of April. The first week came and went. The second week. By the start of the third week, with no judge and no word, the town had passed clean out of impatience and into something closer to dread. Because if Ambrose Sayer was late, Ambrose Sayer, who was never late, then something had gone wrong out there on the road. And in a country that far from anywhere, when something goes wrong out on the road, it is very often the kind of wrong a man does not come back from. And so a strange thing happened to the town of Cedar Gap in those waiting weeks. It began, almost without knowing it, to wait on 2 men instead of 1. There was the judge out on the empty road, the man they needed and could not summon. And there was the young man in the stone jail, the man they had decided to hang, whose fate could not be settled until the first man came. The 2 of them got tangled together in the town's mind, the way things will when there's too much waiting and not enough knowing. Folks would stand in the street of an evening and look up the empty road for the judge, and then their eyes would drift, almost against their will, to the little barred window of the jail where the young man's pale face sometimes showed. Watching the same empty road they were, some of them, not all, but some, began very quietly to feel the first faint stirrings of doubt, not enough to say so out loud, just enough to make the waiting heavier, just enough to make a few of them hope, without quite admitting it, that whatever was keeping the judge would keep him a while longer yet. For as long as the road stayed empty, the gallows stayed empty too. Now, I have to take you away from Cedar Gap for a while, friend. Away from the man in the cell and the empty road and the gray-weathered gallows. Out into the high country, onto that road, to find the judge himself and learn what had become of him. Because while the town was waiting and wondering, Ambrose Sayer was very much alive. He was only somewhere the town would never have thought to look. It had started, as these things do, with a small and reasonable decision. Judge Sayer had finished his court at the last town on the western end of the circuit, a place called Bell Forks, and from there the usual way to Cedar Gap was the long road around the south end of the mountains. The new road, the easy one, 2 extra days of safe and gentle travel. But the judge was running a little behind that spring. The snow had held late. His court at Bell Forks had been a tangled one, and Ambrose Sayer, who had not been late in 30 years and did not intend to start, looked at his map and looked at the calendar and made his choice. He would take the old road. The old road went straight over the shoulder of the range, steeper, rougher, half forgotten, but a full 2 days shorter. He had ridden it once or twice in younger years. He believed he could ride it again, and so, against the advice of the liveryman at Bell Forks, who shook his head and muttered about the spring melt, the judge turned his horse up the old mountain road and rode out of the easy world and into the hard one. It is worth telling you something about the man, friend, as he rode up into those mountains, because the man who rode up was not quite the man who would ride back down. Ambrose Sayer had begun 30 years before as a young lawyer full of fire, who believed the law was a kind of mercy, a way of standing between the weak and the strong, of giving every soul, however poor, a fair and equal hearing. But 3 decades of riding the circuit had done to him what they do. He had seen too much. He had heard too many lies dressed up as truth, sentenced too many men, watched the law be the law, blunt and partial and slow, too many times to keep believing there was mercy. Somewhere along all those miles, Ambrose Sayer had stopped looking at the people in front of him and started looking only at the facts of the case. It was easier that way. A fact didn't beg or weep or keep you awake. He had become a man who measured guilt by what could be proven and felt nothing much either way. And he had told himself this was wisdom. He had told himself this was what a long life in the law made of a serious man. He had not always been alone in it either. There had been a wife once in the early years, a gentle, laughing woman who used to tease him out of his solemnity, who would meet him at the door after a long circuit and listen to his troubles and remind him that the men he'd judged were somebody's sons. She had been the soft place in his hard life, the one who kept the young lawyer's fire banked and alive in him long after he'd have let it go out. But she had died, a good many years back now, of a winter sickness, while he was away on the circuit and could not get home in time. And after that there had been no one to remind him that the men he judged were somebody's sons. The fire went out. The solemnity hardened into something colder, and Ambrose Sayer, with nothing left to ride home to, had simply ridden, town to town, year to year, holding his court and handing down his verdicts. and being, above all, on time, because being on time was the one thing left that he could still be proud of. His promptness was not really a virtue, you understand, though the towns took it for one. It was a kind of grief. A man who has nowhere he wants to arrive makes a religion of arriving exactly when he said he would. He rode all the first day up the old road through fine spring weather and made good time and was pleased with his choice. But on the second day the sky went gray and the rain came on, and it did not stop. It rained that whole second day and into the night, a hard, cold, ceaseless mountain rain. And Ambrose Sayer, soaked to the bone and weary, kept on because keeping on was what he did. And all the while, in the high gullies above him and the long slopes around him, that rain was doing its work, gathering, running, swelling every creek and rivulet, pouring down off the late snow into the rivers below, until the small, quiet fords he'd remembered from his younger days were quiet no longer. He reached the worst of them near noon on the third day. It was a crossing on a river called the Bellwater, a broad, normally shallow ford where the old road went down one bank and up the other, an easy splash across in any ordinary season. But this was no ordinary season. The Bellwater had risen into a brown and boiling thing. Twice its banks, choked with broken branches and whole uprooted trees, roaring loud enough that the judge heard it a half-mile before he saw it. Any sensible man would have stopped. Any sensible man would have turned back or made camp on the high bank and waited the days it would take for the flood to drop. But Ambrose Sayer was 3 weeks, no, he was then but a few days from a town that was waiting on him, with his 30-year record on the line and a stubborn pride where his mercy used to be. And he looked at that roaring river, and he made the second small and unreasonable decision of his journey. He believed he could cross. Now, if you're still awake and this fire is keeping you company tonight, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like more nights like this, a subscribe and a quiet little tap on that bell means I can keep these stories coming, one fire at a time. But for now, let's get back to where we were, back to the high mountain road and the roaring brown river and the proud old judge urging his horse down into water that no horse should ever have been asked to enter. I'll not draw it out, friend, for it was a terrible few minutes, and this is a story meant to bring you peace, not to set your heart to racing in the dark. But you should know what happened at the Bellwater crossing, because everything that came after grew out of it. The horse went in brave enough, the way a good horse will when its rider asks. For the first few strides it held the bottom, breast in the current, and the judge began to think he'd judged it right after all. And then they reached the deep of the channel, where the flood ran hardest, and the bottom fell away, and the river simply took them. It swept the horse off its feet and rolled it, and Ambrose Sayer was torn from the saddle and pitched into the cold brown roar, and the world became a churning, freezing, lightless thing with no up and no down in it. He was an old man and a poor swimmer, and burdened with sodden clothes and boots, and he had, by every reasonable measure, just come to the end of his 30-year road. That he did not is owed entirely to another soul, a soul the town of Cedar Gap was at that very moment swearing up and down did not exist. For there was a woman at the river crossing. Her name was Ruth, and she lived in an old log cabin set back from the high bank of the Bellwater in a stand of pines on the abandoned road, a cabin most of the world had forgotten, on a road most of the world no longer used. She had heard the flood rising for 2 days, and on that third day, drawing water, she had seen far out in the brown chaos of the river a dark shape that was a horse, and another that was a man. And without a moment's thought for her own safety, she had run down to the water's edge with a coil of rope she kept for just such river troubles. And she had waded into her waist against that killing current. And when the flood carried the drowning judge close enough to the bank, she had cast the rope and caught him and hauled and would not let go. A lone woman, dragging a grown man back from the heart of a flood by main strength and stubbornness and the simple refusal to watch a stranger die. She got him out. She got him up the bank, gray and still and barely breathing, his lungs full of river. She turned him and pressed the water out of him until it coughed and choked and dragged in a breath of his own. And then, because he could not walk and she could not carry him far, she fetched a kind of sledge she used for hauling wood, and she rolled the half-drowned judge onto it, and she dragged him up through the pines to her cabin and got him out of his frozen clothes and built her fire high and laid him in her own bed under every blanket she owned. When Ambrose Sayer woke at last, it was full dark, and he was somewhere warm, and he did not know where on God's earth he was. There was a low fire, and the smell of pine smoke and broth, and a single candle, and a woman he had never seen sitting beside him, watching him with calm, tired eyes. He tried to ask where he was, and what had happened, and how long, and found he had no voice and no strength for any of it. The fever was already coming up in him from the cold, and the water in his lungs. And so the great Judge Ambrose Sayer, who had never in 30 years been late, who measured all the world by facts and proofs, and owed no soul a thing, that proud old man closed his eyes again in a stranger's bed, in a cabin that wasn't supposed to exist, on a road the world had forgotten, and gave himself over, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely into the hands of another human being. He was 3 weeks in that cabin, friend. 3 weeks. The same 3 weeks that young Will Tanner was scratching onto the wall of his cell, 100 miles and a whole world away. The first week the judge was scarcely in this world at all. The fever from the river took him deep, and there were nights Ruth sat by him certain he would not see the morning, cooling his brow and spooning broth between his cracked lips, and talking to him low and steady, the way you talk to a frightened animal, though he could not have told you a word she said. She had no doctor to send for. The nearest was days away, on the far side of the very flood that had nearly killed him. She had only what she knew, how to break a fever with cool cloths and patience, how to coax a sick man to drink, how to keep a fire and a vigil through the long mountain nights. She had nursed before, you understand. She knew the work, and she gave it to this drowned stranger as freely and as fully as if he had been her own kin, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply because he was a living soul who needed it, and she was the one soul there to give it. And here is where the thawing of Ambrose Sayer began. for a man who has spent 30 years above other people, judging them, sentencing them, keeping always the high, cold distance of the bench. There is no schooling in the world like being made utterly helpless and utterly dependent on the kindness of a stranger. The judge could do nothing for himself those first days. He could not rise, could not feed himself, could not so much as turn over without help. Everything that kept him alive came from the hands of this woman who owed him nothing, who did not even know his name. Who would gain not one thing from his living, and lose not one thing by his dying? And who tended him, hour after hour, day after day, with a steady tenderness he had not been shown by anyone in more years than he wanted to count? He lay there in his weakness and his shame, and he watched her do it. And something in him that had been frozen hard for 30 years began very slowly to give. As the second week came, and the fever broke and he found his voice again, they began to talk. There was little else to do. The flood still ran high. The road was impassable. And they two were sealed up together in that small warm cabin with the rain on the roof and the river roaring beyond the trees. The judge learned she lived there alone, but for a boy. Her son, Joel, a quiet, watchful child of 9 who hauled the wood and tended the few hens and looked at the strange old man in his mother's bed with grave, dark eyes. He learned that Ruth grew what they ate and traded pelts and eggs at a settlement 2 days off when the weather allowed, and that the abandoned road suited her fine. For she had not come out here to be among people. He did not press her on why. He had learned that much at least in 3 decades of hearing folks' troubles, that a person tells you the heart of their story when they're ready, and not a moment before. So he waited, and he watched her go about her hard, solitary life with that same uncomplaining steadiness. And he found, to his own great surprise, that he had begun to think her one of the finest people he had ever known. It was the boy, Joel, who thought him the rest of the way, though the boy never knew it and meant nothing by it. Children have a way of doing that to a hardened man, of slipping past all his defenses without even trying, because they don't know the defenses are there. At first, Joel kept his distance, watchful as a young deer, for he was a child who had learned early that the world was a place of few people and fewer you could count on. But a sick old man flat on his back is about the least frightening thing there is. And by, the boy crept closer and began to linger by the bed of an evening, and then to ask questions, for he had met very few men in his short life, and here was one who had been everywhere and seen everything. The judge, who had not spoken to a child in longer than he could recall, found himself telling Joel about the wide world beyond the mountains, about cities and railroads, and the great courthouses back east, and the ocean, which the boy could scarcely credit was a thing so big you couldn't see across it. And in the telling of it, something woke up in Ambrose Sayer that he'd thought long dead. He remembered what it was to be glad of another person's company. He remembered watching that grave, dark-eyed boy laugh at one of his stories that he had once, long ago, hoped to have children of his own, before grief and the circuit had hollowed out his life and left only the law in it. He lay in that bed and let a 9-year-old stranger thaw 30 years of ice out of his chest, and the wonder of it was that he let it happen at all. What he did not yet know, what he could not yet know, was that the woman who had pulled him from the river was the very woman a dying stranger had begged a young drifter to find. That the cabin he lay healing in was the cabin at the river crossing the whole town of Cedar Gap swore was empty, and that the threads of his own near drowning and a far-off man's near hanging were even now beginning to draw together into a single knot that only he, of all the people in that wide country, would ever be able to untie. It was in the 3rd week, when the judge was well enough to sit up by the fire wrapped in a blanket, that Ruth told him at last who she was. It came out slow, the way such things do in the long, quiet evenings. A piece here, a piece there, drawn out less by his questions than by the simple fact that he was a kind ear in a life that had not had one in a long while. She had not always lived alone in the mountains, she told him. She had grown up far to the east, in a town with a name, the daughter of a man named Amos Tarr. And here she stopped a while and looked into the fire before she went on. Her father, she said, had been a hard man and a wanderer, never able to stay, never able to be still. When Ruth was a girl no older than her own Joel was now, Amos Tarr had gone off west to make his fortune and left his wife and daughter behind with promises he never kept. The money he was always going to send did not come. The letters grew few and then stopped. Ruth's mother had waited for him for years and grown bitter and then grown ill and died still half listening for a step on the porch that never came. And Ruth herself had grown up swearing she'd never wait on any man the way her mother had married young to get away, lost her husband to a fever, taken her boy and gone as far from people and their promises as a road would carry her, all the way out to a forgotten crossing on a forgotten river, where no one could disappoint her ever again. She had not seen her father nor heard one word of him in better than 20 years. She did not know if he was living or dead. She had decided long ago that it did not matter to her either way. Now, friend, Ambrose Sayre had been a judge for 30 years, and a judge, a good one, is above all a man who listens and remembers and fits the pieces of a story together. And as he sat there by that fire listening to Ruth Tarr speak the name of her vanished father, a cold, strange feeling began to move up his spine that had nothing to do with the fever, because Ambrose Sayre knew that name. He sat there with the firelight on his gaunt face and let it come to him slowly, the way a man lets a word he's forgotten rise up of its own accord rather than chasing it. Tarr, Amos Tarr. He had read it somewhere, and recently in that particular cold context that meant a case, and a judge of 30 years carries the cases in him the way an old soldier carries the campaigns, filed away in some deep, dry drawer of the mind. He turned it over. Where had he read it? Not in any court back east, not in the long ago, recent. This very circuit, and then the drawer slid open and he had it. He had read it. He had read it in the bundle of papers the sheriff of Cedar Gap had sent ahead to the last town on the circuit the papers laying out the cases the judge would hear when he arrived, the debts and the disputes, and the one hard case, the killing on the old road. He had read the cold facts of it weeks ago and thought nothing much of them, the way he'd trained himself to do. A young drifter, one Will Tanner, charged with the murder and robbery of an old traveler found dead on the mountain road, and the name of the dead old traveler, written there in the sheriff's careful hand, had been Amos Tarr. The judge sat very still by the fire. He did not say anything, not yet, but the knot had begun to untie itself in his mind, thread by thread, and he saw with a clarity that took his breath what no one in Cedar Gap could possibly have seen. The old man dead on the road and the long-lost father of the woman who had saved his life were one and the same. Amos Tarr had not vanished into the West forever. After all those years, the old wanderer had turned at last toward home, had set out, an old man, and by the look of the papers, a sick one, down the same forgotten mountain road, bound surely for the same forgotten crossing, coming, after 20 years and more, to find the daughter he had abandoned. And he had died on the road before he could reach her. With his last breath, he had pressed his wallet into the hands of a passing stranger and begged him to carry it on to a woman at the river crossing, to tell her he was sorry, that he'd come at last. The judge did not sleep that night, friend. He lay in the dark of that cabin and put the rest of it together, piece by piece, and the more he saw, the more sure he became. And the more sure he became, the more a kind of dread grew in him, for he knew now what was waiting back in Cedar Gap, and he knew how close it was to going terribly wrong. Consider what he could see that the town could not. A young drifter found kneeling over a dead man, with the dead man's blood on his hands and the dead man's wallet beside him. To Cedar Gap, an open and shut killing, but the judge had read the rest of the sheriff's papers too. He remembered now that the old man's body had borne no bullet wound and no knife wound. He had died. The papers said of a great rush of blood from within, and there had been old blood on his clothes from before, and a deep, racking look to him, the look of a man long sick. To a town that wanted a murderer, that was a detail to be brushed aside. But to a judge lying awake fitting the threads together, it was the truth shining clear through the whole sad muddle. Amos Tarr had been dying for a long time. Consumption? Most like, or something near it. The slow kind of dying that a man can feel coming for months. That makes an old wanderer turn for home at last, while he still has road left in him. He had not been murdered. He had collapsed and died on that road of the sickness he'd carried into it, with no hand raised against him at all. And the blood on young Will Tanner's hands had been the blood of a man he was trying to hold up, not strike down. And the wallet that the town had pointed to as the proof of robbery, there it was. The very crux of it. A thief takes a wallet and runs. Will Tanner had not run. Will Tanner had been kneeling in the open road at dusk with the wallet in plain sight beside him, because he had not stolen it at all. It had been given to him, pressed on him by a dying man with a dying wish, And the young fool, the honest young fool, had stayed there trying to take in the weight of what he'd been asked to do when the riders came and damned him for it. Far from being the worst man on that road, Will Tanner had been the best. He was the one stranger out of all the world who, finding a dying man alone in the dust, had not ridden on by, but had knelt down and held him and taken his hand and agreed to carry his last sorrow the final mile to the daughter he had wronged. The daughter who, 100 miles away and 3 weeks later, had waded into a flood to save the life of another stranger. The one man alive who could set the whole thing right. Ambrose Sayer lay in the dark and felt 30 years of hardness break apart in his chest like river ice in the spring. He thought of all the cold, sure verdicts he had handed down, weighing only what could be proven, feeling nothing either way. He thought of how easily, how very easily, he might have ridden into Cedar Gap on his appointed day 3 weeks ago, before he knew any of this and looked at the cold facts of the case. Blood and wallet, and a story about a woman no one believed in, and sent young Will Tanner to the gallows by the letter of the law, and felt nothing much and ridden on. He would have hanged the one good man on the road, and he would never ever have known. It was the flood that had saved Will Tanner. It was the judge's own pride and his fall and his near drowning in these 3 lost weeks in a forgotten cabin, the very lateness that the whole town was cursing him for, that had carried Ambrose Sayer to the one place in all the world where the truth was waiting to be found. He had to get back the moment the river dropped enough to cross. He had to get back to Cedar Gap before that gray, weathered gallows was put to use. And he lay there in the dark, friend, and he made himself look squarely at a thing that most men spend their whole lives turning away from. He made himself count up the cost of the man he had let himself become. How many times in 30 years had he ridden into a waiting town exactly on his appointed day, and looked at the cold facts of some case, and weighed only what could be proven, and felt nothing much either way, and ridden on? How many Will Tanners had stood before his bench over those 3 decades? How many honest souls, undone by how a thing looked, rather than how it was, and been measured by a man who had stopped long ago, looking past the facts to the living person behind them? He could not know. That was the worst of it. He could not ever know how many he had gotten wrong, because he had trained himself so well not to wonder. The promptness he had been so proud of, the iron record of never being late, he saw it now for the cold, hollow thing it was. A man who arrives on the day but cannot see the soul in front of him has arrived nowhere worth being. It had taken a river to teach him that. It had taken being made helpless and saved by a stranger, and shown over 3 slow weeks what plain human kindness looked like, to remind a judge of the one thing a judge most needs and most easily forgets, that every name in his cold papers belonged to a person, and that persons are not facts, and must not be weighed as if they were. He had nearly hanged a good man for want of that knowing. He would not do it now, and he swore to himself, in the dark of Ruth's cabin, that he would not ride the rest of his road the way he'd ridden it so far. The flood broke at last near the end of that 3rd week, and the Bellwater fell back toward its banks. And on the first morning, a horse could ford it. Ambrose Sayer was up and dressed in his dried and mended clothes, still gaunt, still weak, leaning on a stick. Ruth lent him her own horse and her boy Joel to guide him to the place where the old road met the new. And the judge, before he left, sat a long while with Ruth at her table and told her, gently, all of it, who the dead man on the road had been, that her father, after all the silent years, had been coming home to find her when he died, that he had sent her with his last breath by way of a stranger, the only thing he had left to send, his wallet and 3 words, that he was sorry, that he'd come at last. I will not tell you everything that passed across that woman's face, friend, for some things are too much a person's own to be told by a fire. She had spent 20 years deciding it did not matter to her whether her father lived or died. She learned in that one quiet morning that it had mattered all along, and that he had known it too in the end, and had died trying to say so. She wept, and then she was still. And then, for she was Ruth, who pulled drowning strangers from rivers and asked nothing, she dried her face and packed the judge food for the road, and told him to go, and go fast, and bring that young man home safe, the one who had held her father while he died. Tell him, she said, that there is a woman at the river crossing after all. Tell him she is grateful. Tell him he can stop counting the days. Ambrose Sayer rode into Cedar Gap that evening, 3 weeks and 2 days late, mud to his knees and gray in the face, more dead than alive in the saddle, and the whole town came pouring out into the street at the sight of him. He did not stop to rest. He did not change his ruined clothes. He called the court into session that very night in the back room of the land office with a flag in the corner, and he had them bring Will Tanner up from the jail, the young man blinking in the lamplight, thin and quiet, not yet daring to hope. And before the packed and astonished room, the great, hard, punctual Judge Ambrose Sayer told them where he had been. He told them about the old road and the flood and the woman who had pulled him from the river. He told them her name. He told them whose daughter she was. And then, thread by thread, in the plain, clear voice of a man who has weighed a thing to the grain and is sure of it at last, he laid the whole truth before them. The sickness, the wallet, the dying wish. And he told the people of Cedar Gap that the young man they had been 3 weeks ready to hang was not a murderer and not a thief, but the single honest soul who had stopped on a lonely road to comfort a dying stranger, and that if there was a man in that room who had done as much good in his life as Will Tanner had done in that 1 hour by the road, he had yet to meet him. He freed him that night, and the gallows came down within the week, and folks were careful after not to look at it too long while it stood. For there is a particular shame in a town that has built a thing like that for a man who never deserved it, and Cedar Gap felt that shame as it ought. I wish you could have seen the room that night, friend, the way it was described to me. A back room lit by 2 lamps, packed shoulder to shoulder with every soul in Cedar Gap who could squeeze in, and a good many more crowded at the door and the window, all of them gone dead silent as the gaunt, mud-spattered judge spoke. There were men in that room who had ridden out 3 weeks before, certain of what they'd seen, and tied a young stranger's hands. There were men who had cut and raised the gallows timber with their own hands, and one by one, as the judge laid the truth before them thread by thread, you could see it cross their faces, the slow, sick turning of men who realized all at once and all together that they had very nearly done a terrible thing, and would have done it gladly, and would never have known. Sheriff Hatch stood at the back with his strongbox under his arm, and when the judge came to the matter of the wallet, to the plain fact that every coin in it was untouched, which was the proof that no robbery had ever happened, the sheriff closed his eyes a moment, and a kind of weight seemed to go off him that he'd been carrying 3 weeks. For here at last was a man saying out loud the very thing that had kept him awake. And young Will Tanner stood in the lamplight through all of it, thin and blinking and silent. And the story goes that he did not weep until the judge looked at him direct and told him he was free to go. And that then he put his face in his unbound hands and wept like a boy, not from fear, for the fear was past, but from the sheer unlooked-for grace of being believed at last by the one man who'd had the power to hang him. As for the rest, well, the way I heard it, friend, it ended about as gently as such a story can. Will Tanner did at last carry the wallet to the woman at the river crossing, for he would not be talked out of finishing what the dying man had asked of him. Late as it was, he rode the old road with the judge's blessing, and he gave Ruth her father's last gift and his last sorrowful words with his own hands. And he stayed, the story goes, a day, and then another, helping mend what the flood had torn up around her cabin. And then it seems he found he was in no hurry to leave that forgotten crossing, and that Ruth and young Joel were in no hurry to see him go. I won't tell you more than that, for it isn't mine to tell, but I'll say only that a drifter who hold a dying stranger's hand is the kind of man a careful woman might decide, in time, was worth the risk of waiting on after all, and that a boy who has grown up with no man to teach him the breadth of the world might find, in a quiet young fellow who'd ride the old road just to keep a dead man's promise, exactly the kind of man worth learning from. The crossing that the whole world had given up for empty was not empty long. There came to be smoke from that chimney most evenings, and 3 sets of tracks in the mud by the river, and a kind of peace out there on the forgotten road that none of the 3 of them had thought, before that strange spring, they would ever be lucky enough to find. And Ambrose Sayer rode on to the next town and the next, and finished out his circuit that year as he always had. But he was not the same judge after the Bellwater. The men who came before his bench in the years that were left to him said he had gone strange in his old age, that he had got slow and patient and curious, that he asked too many questions, that he looked at a man a long while before he ruled, as though trying to see past the cold facts of the case to the living soul behind them. They did not know what had happened to him on a flooded river and in a forgotten cabin. They only knew that the hardest judge on the circuit had somehow, late in his life, gone soft in the one place it counts, and that fewer men hanged in those mountains in his last years than ever had before. He had remembered, you see, the thing he'd known as a young man, and let the long road wear out of him, that the law is only worth anything at all when it remembers to be merciful. It had taken a flood to wash it back into him. But it came back. It came back. And that is the way I heard it told. The fire's getting low now, friend. Just embers and the soft glow of them on the walls. And the night gone quiet and kind outside the door. Somewhere in the long ago, a proud old judge fell into a river that should have killed him, and a lonely woman pulled him out, and because of it, a good young man did not hang, and a daughter learned, too late but not quite too late, that she had been loved after all. It took a flood and 3 weeks of lateness and a great deal of trouble to set it all right. But it was set right. The threads drew together the way they sometimes do, and not one soul who ought to have lived was lost. And that's a thing worth carrying down into sleep with you tonight. So let that be your last thought as you drift off. Not the gallows and not the flood, but the rope cast out across the brown water, and the truth that came home just in time, and the woman at the crossing who turned out to be there all along. The world is full of folks who'll swear there's no one out on that forgotten road. Don't you believe them too quickly, friend. There's nearly always someone out there, and nearly always, if we'll only go and look, the truth is kinder than we feared. You rest easy tonight, and if this story gave you a quiet place to land, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.